July 2nd, 2008. Colombia. 2 helicopters land in the jungle clearing. FARC rebels greet men in revolutionary garb, not realizing they've just welcomed their worst nightmare. Within minutes, their prized hostages will vanish in what would become history's most audacious rescue. Here are some times cartels messed with the wrong special ops. February 7th, 1985. Guadalajara, Mexico. An American DEA agent vanishes in broad daylight. Enrique Kiki Camarena was just heading to lunch with his wife when armed men forced him into a car and sped away. But what the Guadalajara cartel didn't realize was that by targeting Kiki, they had just signed their own death warrant. What followed would be Operation Leyenda, a mission that would expose the brutal power of Mexican cartels, and shows just how far the U.S. would go when someone takes one of their own. 1980. Mexico. Today you can see grandparents vacationing on its beautiful beaches, people experiencing their rich and immense culture. But Mexico back then was the epicenter of drug trafficking, and at the front of this trade, the Guadalajara cartel. Led by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, also known as the Godfather, this cartel controlled vast amounts of the drug trade, pushing literally tons of drugs into the U.S. every single day. And that's when Kiki came into the picture. He wasn't an ordinary agent. This guy was passionate, fearless, and deeply committed to dismantling the cartels. And this wasn't some job he fell into, it was who he'd always been. Even as a child, Kiki's mom, seen here, saw that unmistakable fire for justice that just wouldn't quit.
Cuando era niño muy travieso, muy travieso. Chiqui, esto, lo otro, mamá, déjeme a mí solo. Y me dijo, voy a subir alto, 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 mucho, mucho para arriba.
His work had already led to the discovery of a massive drug plantation known as Rancho Bufalo, which infuriated the cartel. The plantation was worth billions, and in one raid, Kiki alone cost him more money than most people would ever see in 10 lifetimes. And that's exactly when the cartel first took notice of Kiki. February 7th, 1985, U.S. Consulate, Guadalajara. Kiki's kidnapped in broad daylight. Witnesses see him being forced into a car by armed men, and what followed would be a month-long massive search for a U.S. DEA agent in the depths of cartel territory, and a painful lesson for drug traffickers about what happens when they target American agents. The DEA launched an unprecedented investigation. Operation Leyenda, named after the Spanish word for legend, was born. Their mission was to find Kiki and bring in the people that took him to justice. But this wasn't just a search for one man. It was the beginning of America's war against the cartels.
Over several days, including a gruesome event that ultimately resulted in his death. That's the red line that doesn't get crossed.
The investigation quickly revealed a horrifying truth. Kiki had been tortured and then murdered. The details of what happened next would be terrifying. After they grabbed him, Kiki was taken to a house where he was tortured for days. The beatings were relentless. Kiki would beg him to stop and plead for his family's safety, but the cartel showed absolutely no mercy. They wanted to break him completely before he died, to send a message to anyone who might follow in his footsteps. Camarena died after enduring several days of torture, and what remained of him was eventually found wrapped in plastic bags and dumped on the side of a random dirt road. The U.S. government was determined to respond. Operation Leyenda became a full-scale offensive, involving not just the DEA but also FBI, CIA, and Mexican authorities. The hunt for Camarena's killers was relentless. American agents working with Mexican law enforcement tracked down key members of the Guadalajara cartel, and one by one the perpetrators were either arrested or simply killed in shootouts. For the first time, the cartel found themselves as the hunted rather than the hunters. One of the most notorious figures would be Rafael Caro Quintero, a high-ranking cartel member who was directly involved in Camarena's kidnapping and murder. When they found him, he was living in luxury, probably thinking he'd gotten away with it. But he was wrong. Quintero was captured in Costa Rica in 1985 and sent right back to Mexico, where he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Operation Leyenda changed the game forever in ways many might not have expected. For the DEA, it was a turning point. The agency gained new resources and authority to combat international drug trafficking. What the cartel thought would frighten away its agents instead created a more powerful, more determined enemy. But the operation also exposed the deep corruption within Mexican law enforcement and government, and it soon became clear that the cartels had infiltrated every level of society, which made it incredibly difficult to bring him down.
A broad range of U.S. officials believes that drug dealers have corrupted some elements within the Mexican government, especially within the police. But that is talked about quietly in diplomatic circles.
But the investigation also revealed something even more sinister. It turned out that Mexican officials weren't only looking the other way, some were actually in on it. Cops, government officials, and even people high up in Mexican law enforcement had helped capture and kill Kiki. And some were even in the room as it happened. This level of corruption hit American authorities like a truck, and just like that, the whole game was changed. The drug war wasn't simply about catching dealers anymore. It was about fighting an entire system built to protect them. And as time went on, Operation Leyenda's impact only grew bigger. The DEA set up offices worldwide, beefed up their intelligence operations, and created whole new playbooks for dismantling cartels. And all of this because the Guadalajara cartel made that one fateful mistake, and that was killing an American DEA agent. But they weren't the only ones to make that mistake. Some drug lords thought they were completely untouchable, like the notorious kingpin who escaped prison twice, only to find himself in the crosshairs of one of the most sophisticated manhunts in history. And that's coming up next. February 22nd, 2014. Mazatlan, Mexico, a beach resort town on the Pacific coast typically filled with tourists enjoying the sunshine. But on this day, something else was going to go down at the Miramar condominiums. In the early hours of the morning, a team of Mexican Marines prepared to raid a luxury apartment. Their target, the most wanted man in all of America. They were about to capture Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the man who had slipped through their fingers time and time again. As one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, his organization was moving drugs by the ton. They had entire regions of Mexico under their thumb and had spread its tentacles into more than 50 countries worldwide. But El Chapo's most remarkable talent was his uncanny ability to disappear whenever authorities got too close. June 9, 1993, Guatemala. El Chapo's caught for the first time and sent right back to Mexico, where he's sentenced to 20 years in prison. But those prison walls might as well have been made of paper, because just after 8 years, El Chapo manages to pull off his first vanishing act. He escapes from the Puente Grande prison by hiding in a laundry cart, some say, and strolling right out the front door on January 19, 2001. And for the next 13 years, El Chapo became a ghost. Just as no jail could hold him, no police could find him either. He seemingly vanished off the face of the planet, and yet his empire was growing stronger than ever before.
Since 1990, Border Patrol agents have discovered at least 230 cross-border tunnels running from Mexico into California and Arizona. They've seized loads of cocaine, amphetamines, and marijuana inside them.
El Chapo managed to stay hidden through pure criminal genius. He slipped through safe houses tucking deep beneath the Sinaloa mountains, protected by an army of lookouts who'd warn of approaching authorities. His gunmen patrolled the surrounding areas, creating an invisible fortress around him. And with each passing year, his legend only grew larger, and so did the Sinaloa cartel's grip on the drug trade. But in 2014, the game changed completely. After years of watching El Chapo slip through their fingers time and time again, American and Mexican authorities decided to scrap their old playbook. Instead of chasing his entire organization, they zeroed in on one target, El Chapo himself. Everything started with intelligence. The Americans brought in some high-tech stuff that could track El Chapo's calls and messages, all while he was thinking he was invisible. El Chapo was being smart by using encrypted phones and switching devices regularly. But what he didn't know was that U.S. intelligence had already managed to compromise his entire communication network. And for months, they listened, watched, and waited, piecing together the puzzle of his movements. Turns out El Chapo was staying at a beachfront condo in Mazatlan with his wife, Emma Coronel, and their twin daughters. The planners of Operation Black Swan knew they had one shot at this. So their plan was simple. They'd strike at first light when guards would be tired and security at its weakest. They'd use only Mexican Marines. Because after what happened at Kiki Camarena, they were the only Mexican force the Americans fully trusted. The team would then have to move lightning fast, avoiding any shootouts that might give El Chapo precious seconds to vanish again. The 2014 operation was successful, and El Chapo was captured and imprisoned once again. But in this almost unbelievable twist, on July 11, 2015, he escaped again, this time through an elaborate mile-long tunnel dug directly into his prison cell shower. January 8, 2016. After 6 months on the run, Mexican authorities launched yet another operation to recapture El Chapo. The streets stayed dead quiet as Marines made their way into safe houses where Chapo was rumored to be staying. The body cam footage captures the actual raid. Moment by moment, Marines sweep through hallways with their weapons, when suddenly, gunfire erupts. El Chapo's bodyguards fight desperately, trying to buy their boss those precious seconds he needs to vanish again. The Marines respond with overwhelming force. Room by room, they clear the building until they stumble upon a mirror that doesn't look quite right. They smash through and find a hidden room behind. But once again, it was empty. El Chapo managed to sneak through a hidden hatch. The Marines found a huge collection of weapons in the apartment, including rocket-propelled grenades and assault rifles. And then, their radios crackled with urgent news. El Chapo had been spotted across town. He managed to slip through a tunnel system that ran beneath the building and emerged only a few blocks away, trying to escape in a beaten-up old car. The Marines raced to cut him off and surrounded the vehicle before he could disappear again. As they led El Chapo away, one Marine recalled the look on his face, not anger or defiance, but shock. For perhaps the first time in his life, El Chapo had been outsmarted. And this time, the Mexican government wasn't taking any chances. Within a year, they extradited him to the U.S., where he was put on trial in New York.
The world's most wanted narco looked confused, overwhelmed even, asking the DEA agent, "Where am I?" "Nueva York," they told him. His face says it all.
2019. After a dramatic 3-month trial that revealed the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. And today he's sitting nicely at ADX Florence in Colorado, America's most secure supermax prison. Now, Operation Black Swan needed guns and battering rams. But our next story reveals a completely different approach to taking down criminal organizations. July 2nd, 2008. A remote jungle clearing in Colombia. 2 civilian choppers descend from the sky, kicking up dust as they land. Men in Che Guevara t-shirts and FARC armbands step out, greeting the guards. It looks like a routine prisoner transfer, but these weren't FARC rebels. And this wasn't a routine transfer. This was Operation Yaque, the boldest and most creative hostage rescue in modern history. But how did Colombian Special Ops pull off a mission so audacious it could be part of a Hollywood script? And how the hell did they free 15 hostages, including former presidential candidate Ingrid Betancourt, without firing a single shot? Early 2000s. Colombia. The country was being torn apart by a brutal civil conflict with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as the FARC. They were a massive guerrilla army with 18,000 fighters that controlled vast territories and funded themselves through kidnapping, extortion, and the drug trade. The FARC turned kidnapping into an industry because at one point they were holding over 700 hostages in jungle prison camps, forcing families to listen to proof-of-life recordings on the radio while demanding millions in ransom. Among their most valuable captives would be Ingrid Betancourt, a French-Colombian politician who was kidnapped in 2002 while campaigning for president. Her captivity became an international cause, with her face appearing on posters across Europe and regular demonstrations demanding her release.
Simplemente nunca había experimentado lo que era el verdadero miedo. Esto cambió el 23 de febrero del 2002. Yo en ese momento era candidata a la presidencia de Colombia y estaba adelantando mi agenda de campaña cuando fui detenida por un grupo de hombres armados.
Alongside Betancourt were 14 other high-value hostages, including 3 American defense contractors, Keith Stansel, Mark Gonsalves, and Thomas Howes. Their plane crashed in FARC territory in 2003 during a counter-narcotics mission, and they'd been prisoners ever since.
There was a time that when I slept, I would dream that I was free. That time was only a few days ago. It feels so good to be free here now with all of you.
They were kept chained by the neck, forced to march for days through dense jungle whenever the military got too close, and lived in constant fear of execution. Some of them had even been captives for over a decade, with little hope of ever seeing their families again. For years, the Colombian government exhausted every option to free the hostages. Previous military rescue attempts had ended in disaster. During one operation, the FARC executed 11 politicians at the first round of approaching soldiers. Peace talks fell apart, with guerrillas making demands the government simply couldn't accept. And by 2008, President Álvaro Uribe was at his wit's end. That's when Colombian military intelligence came forward with a rescue plan so bold and unexpected that the FARC would never anticipate it. Operation Jaque, which takes its name from the Spanish checkmate, was unlike any hostage rescue before it. There'd be no raids, no gunfire, and no direct confrontation. Instead, the plan relied entirely on deception. Colombian intel discovered that the FARC's leadership was planning to move Betancourt and other high-value hostages to a new location. That created a rare opportunity, a moment when the hostages would be gathered together and on the move. The plan was as bold as it was risky. Colombian special forces would pose as FARC members and humanitarian workers from a fictional international NGO. They would convince the local FARC commander that they had been sent by FARC leadership to collect these hostages and transport them to meet with Alfonso Cano, the group's top leader. But for this to work, every single detail had to be perfect. The soldiers spent months growing their hair and beards to look like these guerrillas. They studied hours of FARC videos to adopt their mannerisms, slang, and their revolutionary rhetoric. Some would even embed with former FARC members to perfect their cover. Now, the Colombian soldiers were trained by American Special Forces advisors, who helped them craft an unbreakable cover story and practiced every possible scenario. And if this operation sounds just like a Hollywood movie, it's probably because it was rehearsed just like one. If the FARC realized it was a trick, the rescue team would have been outnumbered in hostile territory, and the hostages would have been killed immediately. We take you to July 2nd, 2008. The operation set in motion. 2 white Mi-17 choppers disguised to look like civilian aircraft used by humanitarian organizations took off toward the jungle meeting point. Aboard would be elite Colombian soldiers disguised as FARC rebels, humanitarian workers, and journalists. They even brought along a fake Australian hostage to make the scenario more believable. So when they land at the rendezvous point, the real FARC commander, Cesar, greets them, completely unaware. These guys had to stay in character the whole time. They would even speak in their revolutionary language and present fake orders from the FARC leadership. They told Cesar they were going to transport these hostages to meet with Alfonso Cano for a potential prisoner exchange. And it worked. The FARC seemed to believe them. But the real test came when the hostages were brought out from the jungle. Betancourt and the others had no idea this was a rescue attempt. They thought they were simply being transferred to another camp, something that had happened many times before. So the undercover team had to convince both the FARC guards and the hostages themselves that this was a legitimate operation. And as the hostages boarded the choppers, the FARC commander Cesar and one of his lieutenants asked to come along. The rescue team wasn't expecting that one, but they couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. They agreed, bringing the 2 FARC members aboard. Once everyone got into the choppers and the doors were closed, the operation got into its most dangerous phase. The pilots lifted off, and once they were safely in the air, they quickly subdued the 2 FARC members and told the stunned hostages that they were free.
Inside the helicopter, one of their rescuers in disguise yells, "We're the Colombian army," and
"You're free now."
This man was held for a decade.
10 years later.
This is the moment every dream they dared not hope came true.
At first, the hostages were in disbelief. Some of them thought this was just another ploy to break them. But as reality set in, the helicopter erupted into tears, hugs, and prayers. Betancourt, who had endured 6 years of captivity, later described this moment.
The helicopter almost fell from the sky because we were jumping up and down, yelling, crying, hugging one another.
The operation was flawless. Not a single shot fired, not a single person injured, and all 15 hostages were rescued. 2 FARC leaders were captured, and the rest of the FARC unit had no idea what had happened until those choppers were long gone. Operation Ake dealt a devastating psychological blow to the FARC, and it showed that their communications weren't secure, that their chain of command could have been impersonated, and that even their most closely guarded hostages weren't safe. It was a humiliation from which they never fully recovered. For Colombia, it'd be a turning point in their long fight against the guerrillas. Public support for the government soared, and the FARC's image as this invincible jungle force was shattered. Within a few years, defections increased, and the FARC's power began to decline. And by 2016, they would agree to a peace deal and lay down their weapons. But while Operation Ake relied on an elaborate deception, our next story will show you how Peru's most wanted terrorist was finally brought down by something shockingly simple: a discarded tube of medicine. September 12, 1992. Lima, Peru. In a quiet middle-class neighborhood, a 2-story house sits on Los Sauces Street in the Surquillo district. From the outside, it looked like any other house. But behind these walls would be Abimel Guzman, the mastermind behind one of Latin America's most brutal terrorist organizations. And right outside, members of Peru's elite police unit, Tincote, are about to make their move. Early 1980s, Peru. The country was slowly descending into chaos, and at the center of it all would be Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path, one of the scariest guerrilla groups out there. Founded by former philosophy professor Abimel Guzman, it combined Maoist ideology with an almost religious devotion to violence that would shock even other revolutionary movements.
On April 19, 1980, Guzman ordered Shining Path followers to take up arms and prepare to cross a river of blood in their quest for power.
Guzman, calling himself President Gonzalo, wanted to completely destroy Peruvian society so that he could later rebuild it from scratch. Under his leadership, the Shining Path launched a campaign of terror unlike anything Peru had seen before.
Para cambiar una sociedad necesariamente tiene que haber un enfrentamiento, y eso implica violencia.
Between 1980 and 92, the conflict claimed nearly 70,000 lives. The Shining Path bombed electrical towers, leaving Lima in darkness for weeks. They would assassinate mayors, teachers, and community leaders. They would massacre entire villages suspected of cooperating with the government, sometimes even using machetes to save their valuable bullets. By 1990, the Shining Path controlled roughly 40% of Peru's territory. Lima was surrounded by red zones, where government forces couldn't enter. Car bombs exploded in the capital's streets weekly. Foreign embassies warned their citizens not to visit Peru, and the country's economy was in a freefall, with inflation reaching 7,650% in 1990. The government seemed powerless. Military operations on the countryside failed to stop the insurgency, and often resulted in human rights abuses that pushed more people toward the rebels. Now, the situation seemed hopeless until a specialized police intel unit decided to try a completely different approach. Tincote, Peru's National Counterterrorism Directorate, was formed to specifically combat the Shining Path. But unlike the military, which focuses on confronting guerrillas in the field, Tincote aimed directly at the organization's leadership. General Antonio Quintin Vidal, the head of Tincote, assembled a small team of detectives led by Commander Marco Miyashiro. Their mission was seemingly impossible. They had to find Abimel Guzman, who hadn't been seen in public since 1979, and whose whereabouts were one of Peru's greatest mysteries.
Había un enfrentamiento, capturaron como a 6 subversivos. Se los suben al helicóptero y los amarran de los pies. Se los cuelgan como racimos, a los 6, entonces comienzan a interrogarlos. La gente como tenía una ideología bien metida en el cerebro, entonces daban vivas a su partido, a Abimel Guzmán, y se negaban a hablar. Entonces le iban cortando las las sogas que estaban amarradas a sus pies y lo iban dejando caer.
The Dincote team knew they couldn't fight this with force alone, so intel would have to be their primary weapon against Shining Path. And so they began painstakingly infiltrating the organization's urban support networks, turning captured members into informants, and following every possible lead, no matter how small. One of their key advantages was that many Dincote officers came from the same rural areas and lower-class neighborhoods as the Shining Path members, so they understood the cultural context and could blend in during surveillance operations in ways that the military couldn't. Yet these men had no idea that their biggest break would come from something everyone throws away: garbage. Early 1992, Lima, Peru. Dincote raided a Shining Path safe house and discovered discarded tubes of medicine meant to treat psoriasis. This could have easily been brushed off as being just another inconsequential item. But the men working this case day in and day out knew that this might just be the clue they've been waiting for. Their intel reports previously mentioned that Guzman suffered from this skin condition, and the medicine was a rare, high-quality brand. That tiny clue sets off this intensive investigation. Dincote tracked pharmacy sales of the medication across Lima, eventually identifying several locations where someone was regularly purchasing the specific brand. So they established surveillance in those areas, looking for anything that might have seemed unusual. And then another break comes when they raid a house being used for a Shining Path ballet performance, because it turns out the terrorist organization had its own dance troupe that performed revolutionary ballet. The house had many photographs showing Guzman in relatively recent times, confirming he was indeed in Lima, and this would allow agents to update their understanding of his appearance. By September 1992, after extensive efforts, Dincote finally managed to narrow down their search to a specific neighborhood. They found a house where the garbage contained empty bottles of high-quality alcohol and cigarette butts from an expensive foreign brand, which was unusual in a middle-class area during an economic crisis. The house was supposedly used as a dance studio by Maritza Garrido, but her behavior didn't match her story. September 12, 1992, Dincote made their move. In a precisely executed raid, they stormed the house on Los Sauces Street. Upstairs, they find Abimel Guzman sitting at a desk in a room lined with books.
If one dies, this remains in others, and this will never be erased, said Guzman, convinced his legacy would live on.
What surprised the officers was how Guzman surrendered without resistance. The man who had ordered countless brutal killings and portrayed himself as this fearless revolutionary leader simply put his hands up. Alongside him would be several high-ranking Shining Path members, including his lover and second-in-command, Elena Ibarraguirre. The house contained a treasure trove of intelligence, computer disks with membership lists, future attack plans, and even the Shining Path's entire financial structure. That info proved invaluable in dismantling the rest of this organization. Guzman's capture was announced to the Peruvian public the next day, and in order to prevent any myths about his escape or death in battle, the government took the unusual step of presenting him to the media in a bizarre staged appearance. Locked in a cage, wearing a striped prison uniform, Guzman ranted and raved, calling for his followers to continue the revolution. But the image of this once mysterious leader, reduced to a caged, aging man, destroyed the aura of invincibility the Shining Path carefully cultivated all those years. And with Guzman's leadership, the Shining Path quickly fractured. Many members surrendered, or were even captured in subsequent raids. And while splinter groups continued fighting in remote areas, the threat to Peru's existence was effectively over from that day on. Operation Victoria succeeded, where years of military operations had failed, because it recognized a fundamental truth about terrorist organizations. They may have complex structures, but they often rely heavily on key charismatic leaders. By patiently gathering intel and focusing resources on capturing Guzman rather than fighting every battle, Dincote delivered a strong blow that military force alone could never achieve. For Peru, Guzman's capture marked the beginning of recovery. The economy stabilized, foreign investment returned, and people could once again walk the streets of Lima without fear of bombings. Abimael Guzman spent the rest of his life in prison, dying in 2021 at the age of 86. His revolution failed, but the scars it left on Peru can still be seen to this day. Now that's what good old-fashioned detective work looks like. But this next story shows what happens when plans backfire spectacularly, when an operation meant to catch cartel gun runners would instead arm the very criminals it targeted. October 2009. Phoenix, Arizona. ATF watches as suspicious buyers purchase multiple semi-auto rifles, but instead of making arrests, they let them walk, hoping to track them to the big dogs at a later date. Now that was the beginning of what will later be known as Operation Fast and Furious.
Once I arrived in Juarez, within an hour over the police scanners, a body had been found. And then maybe 30 minutes later, another body, then another body, and by the end of the day, it was about 10. Next day, 10. Next day, 10. It was saddening. It was kind of terrifying.
Just across the border in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, La Línea, the enforcement arm of the Juarez cartel, was engaged in a bloody war with the Sinaloa cartel. Made up mostly of former officers, La Línea combined law enforcement training with cartel violence in order to terrorize the region. The concept behind Fast and Furious seems sound in theory. Track the weapons to identify entire trafficking networks. But there was one massive problem. The ATF didn't have the capability to follow these guns once they crossed over into Mexico. So, letting guns walk often meant losing them entirely. Between 2009 and 11, suspects under surveillance purchased over 2,000 firearms, valued at more than $1.5 million. These weapons, including 50 caliber sniper rifles, then disappeared across the border, many ending up right in the hands of the cartels. So as violence escalated in Mexico, these guns began turning up at crime scenes. And one of La Línea's most notorious figures, Marco Antonio Guzman, alias El Brad Pitt, even pioneered the cartel's use of car bombs. The operation would remain hidden for years. That is, until a tragic discovery blew the whole thing wide open. December 14th, 2010. Arizona, Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was killed in a shootout. And at the scene, investigators found 2 rifles that were traced back to Operation Fast and Furious. Whistleblowers within the ATF contacted Congress, revealing the secret program. Congressional hearings followed, along with an inspector general investigation that identified 14 officials responsible for the operation's failures. The political fallout was unprecedented. The House of Representatives held a sitting attorney general in contempt of Congress for the first time in history. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the weapons continued claiming lives. By 2016, firearms from Fast and Furious had been found in at least 69 crime scenes in Mexico, linked to the deaths of approximately 200 Mexican citizens, which included Agent Terry.
No drug kingpins were ever arrested, but the drug cartels became well-armed. Records obtained by CBS News show the weapons were used in a U.S. immigration agent's murder last year in Mexico. They were also used by drug cartels that assassinated a Mexican official's brother and attacked 2 Mexican government helicopters.
Now, up next is something completely different. The story of a single Mexican Marine commander whose ruthlessness struck such fear into cartel members that they trembled at the mere mention of his name. 2016. Tamaulipas, Mexico. Members of the powerful Gulf Cartel received disturbing news. A certain Mexican Marine commander had been spotted in their territory. Within hours, lookouts are doubled, safe houses emptied, and some cartel leaders even choosing to flee the area entirely. Now, what could make these heartless, brutal guys react with such fear? Oh, it was the arrival of El Marino Loco, the crazy Marine.
Estamos en esta tierra tan bonita, Tampico, Tamaulipas, para estar agarrando estos. ¿Qué vamos a agarrar? Malacos que se.
El Marino Loco isn't a character from some cartel folklore. That's a real person, a Mexican naval officer named Eric Morales Guevara, who commanded a special forces unit tasked with fighting cartels in northern Mexico. But unlike some other military commanders who follow standard protocols, Eric over here developed his own unique approach to psychological warfare. His territory was primarily Tamaulipas and Nuevo León, which were dominated by the Gulf Cartel. This was a sophisticated organization with military-grade weapons, thousands of members, and control over entire cities. And while most military operations focused on arrests and seizures, Morales Guevara recognized that cartels derived much of their power from fear and respect. So he attacked something that was way more important than their drug shipments, and that's their pride. His methods were as effective as they were shocking. When Loco raided cartel safe houses, he would push through and do his job, confiscating drugs and weapons. But then he'd take it one step further. He would humiliate the cartel members and strip them of their fearsome image. One of the most infamous operations targeted Sylvester Otto Rodriguez, better yet known as El Chive, a Gulf cartel leader in Tampico. Loco's team didn't just raid the house and destroy possessions, they would take the ashes of El Chive's father from a memorial in that house and leave behind his father's portrait vandalized. That was an escalation beyond the unwritten rules of even their brutal conflicts. El Chive was so enraged that he reportedly placed a $3 million bounty on Morales Guevara's head, one of the largest ever offered for a Mexican military officer. But that was just the beginning. In another notorious raid, El Marino Loco captured Mr. El Memido. But arresting him wouldn't be enough. He dresses him up in women's lingerie, puts makeup on him, and then forces him to kiss his own gunman on camera. And those pictures were leaked online. Now, these psychological tactics had an effect that went beyond individual humiliation. They changed the entire dynamic between the military and cartels. For years, we all thought the cartel was fearless and untouchable. But El Marino pops up out of nowhere and makes them look vulnerable and ridiculous. And yet, despite their obvious effectiveness, his methods were regarded as being highly controversial, even within the Mexican military. You had human rights organizations even going as far as to accuse him of torture and abuse of power. Can't make this shit up. His fellow officers were a little scared that this would provoke more brutal retaliation from the cartels. The American news outlet Breitbart, which closely followed border security issues, published many reports about his operations, highlighting both its effectiveness and the ethical concerns they raised. I don't know, was psychological humiliation justified in fighting organizations responsible for thousands of murders? I'm gonna go ahead and say yes, but the debate remains unsolved. What's undeniable, though, is that his tactics made him the cartel's most hated enemy. Narco banners began popping up in Tamaulipas with threats specifically aimed at El Marino Loco. Get this, the Gulf Cartel publicly accuses him of corruption, claiming that he stole weapons and cash during raids, though many saw that as an attempt to discredit their most effective adversary. Now today, the whereabouts of El Marino Loco remain unknown. Maybe he got dismissed from the Navy, or maybe the cartel's bounty was taken. However, there's a third theory, that Mr. Loco here continues to operate, now leading his own anti-drug squadron outside official channels. We've seen photos of cartel members dressed in lingerie and arrested on social media, but whether that's El Marino Loco himself or some other members of the Mexican military simply paying homage is hard to tell.